run through the slides again real quick, not really doing them any justice. But after that, we will go through and finish up the Skittles examples. And then if we have any time after that, we can just open it up for discussion or any questions. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Yes, getting a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So just some quick reminders. For those of you who haven't completed homework 1, the lock date is tonight at 11. And then CP2 is due next Wednesday by 11 p.m. I just wanted to take a quick second here to plug the post that Fitz put on Ed about asking questions about the kinds of information that is helpful to the TAs and to the instructors to help you guys with your homework questions and your general questions. So if you get a chance, make sure to go ahead and read through this, and hopefully this will help everybody get all of their questions answered as easily as possible. So today, basically, I'm going to go over some anonymous functions, callbacks into this keyword, and then we'll just look at some debugging JavaScript strategies and then jump into Skittles. So we already know how to define a named function, and we have seen some examples of anonymous functions or basically unnamed functions used previously, especially when we were adding event listeners. There's another type of function that is very similar to the anonymous or unnamed function. It's the arrow function. It has very similar syntax, except it removes the function keyword and adds this arrow, hence the arrow designation. There's some cool syntax shorthand that you can use for this. It's in the reading if you got a chance to do it. You don't have to use arrow functions. There are some oddities about them that can make them more confusing, especially if you're familiar with just the traditional anonymous function. So you don't have to use them. But if you do choose to use them, you're going to want to pay attention to some of the differences, especially when it comes to the keyword this. And so the keyword this normally, when referenced in our code, pertains to the global window object. However, if we are in an event listener or a callback that we've added through add event listener, this keyword gets bound to our element. And we saw a couple examples of this in the video, how this works. But if you're not in your callback function, this keyword refers to the window. So if I just open up my JavaScript console here really quickly, and show you guys, this is just a reference to the window. And actually, if we're using strict mode, this keyword outside of a event listener, event handler, actually is undefined. So as long as you're using strict mode, this is undefined unless you're in your callback. I know it's a little confusing, but when you are in your callback, this always refers to the element we've added our event listener to, and we'll see some examples of this. So one of the common ways or common reasons to use anonymous functions we saw was to pass them in to our add event listener function. So we saw with the eat Skittle example, when we double clicked a Skittle, we called this.parentNode.removeTileThis or just this.remove. But we also could have just replaced that with an anonymous function here. Since it is only one line, that may have been a good candidate. Either way is fine, but this is a very common reason for using anonymous functions, and you could have just as easily used an arrow function here instead of an anonymous function, except for the fact that this that this keyword poses a problem. And so let me actually just go over here really quickly. Arrow functions do not bind this. This is really the biggest caveat of using anonymous functions or using arrow functions. When we're in a callback, such as the one for eat Skittle, right? We're in an anonymous function. This refers to the element, the Skittle that we had clicked on. However, if I'm in an arrow function here, this is not bound to the element that our event listener is attached to. So this is one of the oddities for using arrow functions, and that behaves differently from your traditional anonymous function. One of the things I mentioned in the video that is really helpful if you want to use arrow functions because you like the syntax is to always use the event object current target property, because that always refers to the element that the event listener has been attached to. And then you don't have to worry about this sort of oddity and kind of going on with this keyword in anonymous functions versus arrow functions. Aaron asks, what kind of function invocation occurs when events trigger an event handler? I'm not sure I understand the question necessarily. I know the browser takes your callback and specifically binds the this keyword to be the element that the event listener is attached to. And then it also passes in the event object associated with that event, which is accessible within our callback function. If that doesn't answer your question, feel free to follow up with more information, and I or one of the other TAs hopefully will be able to answer that. So going back, though, 2 slides, one of the really big questions or common questions we get when using callback functions or passing in callback functions or attaching event listeners is how do we pass in a parameter to that callback function? I have something, maybe a message like hello world that I want to pass in and have called or used when my callback or event handler is invoked. And the way you can do this is with anonymous functions using either, in this particular case, the traditional anonymous function or the arrow function here. But the caveat we were just talking about, it really just depends on whether you're using the this keyword or whether you're using event.currentTarget. In this particular case, neither of these work on this page because we're referencing this in another function. We're not referencing this directly inside the function that we have used as the callback for our event listener. We are calling out within our anonymous and our arrow functions to a to a second function here that then uses this. So that's really tricky once again to sort of see that there are different layers of these function calls, and this has a different value depending on whether or not you're in an anonymous function or whether you're in an arrow function. And so again, if this confuses you and you don't really want to pay attention to the differences between those two, I highly, highly suggest always referencing the element from the event object. So e.currentTarget will get you what the callback is attached to, and then you can actually pass that in to all of your functions. You can pass that down into a draft reply, for example, in this case, and that will make your life a lot simpler. And so this is just another explicit example of this. So here we have button 1, which is has a click event listener attached to it, and our callback is named function, and the named function just prints out the value of this. And so if I click button 1, you see we get out the string representation of an HTML button element with an ID of 1, which is this button here. In the second case, we're using an anonymous function. and the this keyword still refers to an HTML button element, ID button 2. But if I click here button 3, which is the exact same as the second example here, but uses an arrow function instead, you'll see that the this keyword is actually a reference to the window. So this highlights pretty clearly the differences with the this keyword in an arrow function and an anonymous function. So if you do like to use the this keyword to reference your elements that your event listeners are attached to, make sure you're aware of this difference. Hitesh asks, if you're passing the event object as a param along with other parameters, do you have to always keep the event object as the first parameter? Does the positioning matter? No, well, when you're first invoking a callback function, so for example, here, if I were to just add an event listener to the window, and do an anonymous function and just console log something, right? I have to pass in here in my anonymous function, the very first parameter of my callback, whether it's anonymous or named, will be the event object, right? But then after that point, once I'm inside my function here, I can use any function sort of signature that I want. I can define a function that takes this event object as the second, third, fourth parameter, right? I can define that myself, but the actual callback that you pass into add event listener is expecting to have the event object as the first parameter. Okay, so that's a lot. Anonymous arrow functions, this keyword in callbacks. It's very confusing. It's going to take some time to sink in. So please ask questions, and we'll hopefully see a little bit more of this in the Skittles example as we finish it up. But I'm just going to hit over some really quick debugging strategies for you guys. These are going to seem really simple, I know, but one of the most common things we see is checking to see if your JavaScript file actually loaded. You might laugh at this one, but this does happen quite a bit. People don't know that their JavaScript file, whether or not it has loaded. And so one of the easiest things that you can do is open up your DevTools and go into the Network tab. If you reload your page, you'll actually get a list of all of the resources that have loaded by your page, starting with the HTML. And so this is a really easy way to just walk through a simple example. This is a little convoluted on the slides, but if we look at this on a simple page like this one, you can see my very first resource is my HTML page, and then I can see that my styles have loaded, and then I can see my JavaScript has loaded. But here there's a 404, there's an error because I misspelled it. But if ever something is just not working, you're not even seeing the beginning of your interaction that you expected, the behavior expected on your page, make sure everything is loading as expected. The other one is just to console log everything. I've hopefully demonstrated this quite a bit, but anytime you add an event listener, make sure that that's working. Immediately console log. After accessing an element, especially if it's got a really tricky CSS selector, log it out to the console to make sure that it's the element you expected. Or after a complex calculation, like when we were calculating the random index for our Skittle color, log it out to the console. And finally here, the messages that are printed out in the console are actually really, really nice. They give you the error message, the type of error, where the error originated from, the file, the function name, and the line in your code where that error occurred. And those errors that are printed in the JavaScript console will actually link you to the error in your code in the sources tab. So this particular error is just a request error. This won't link. But if I had another error here, it would tell me the line at which my error occurred. And if I were to click on that error, it would take me over to the sources tab in in Chrome DevTools here and show me the exact line in my code where the error occurred. So make sure you're aware of those, you read those, check the console if you're not seeing the expected behavior on your page. And then finally, JavaScript debugger. A JavaScript debugger does exist in Chrome DevTools, fully fledged. You can put in breakpoints and view the value of local and global variables at certain points. It's really convenient here. I'm just going to look at what is on this page. This happens to be the code for that button example we just went through. Oh gosh. If I were to go back over here, just really quickly. And if I were to put a breakpoint inside my functions here and click button 2, I would actually pause at this point in my function and I could see what the local variables are and their values. Down here, you can see that the event parameter here, the argument is a mouse event. This refers to the button. And so please use the debugger. It's really helpful, super powerful, and there's a lot of features in here that can help you debug your code. Okay, so that was maybe more through the lecture material than I necessarily wanted to go. But because anonymous functions, arrow functions, and callbacks are pretty tricky, I think it was worth taking just a little bit more time to explain that. But now let's move over to the final installment of the Skittles example. And there is code on Ed. However, unfortunately, something is going on with the Ed workspace here. So when I update the JavaScript code, it actually isn't reflected in the web preview. So I'm going to code the rest of this exercise today just directly in my text editor, which I'm going to use Vim. And if you would like to still follow along, go into the lesson for today. Go to this page. Again, this is the Lecture 9 Skittles. This should be available to you. Click the toggle tree view. And if you right click here, you can actually download all of the files locally. So if you do still want to follow along, go ahead, do that, download them, unzip the file into a local directory, and then open the HTML. And we'll go ahead and get started here. And just so as a reminder for everybody, today we are actually going to be starting with an updated interface. So we've already added some of the major functionality that we needed. And so now we're going to finish this off here and fill in the remaining aspects. And I'm going to go here and show what the example is. And so this is the expected behavior. When we hit start, we fill the page, fill the jar with random Skittle colors. We get a color in the title that we're supposed to guess the number of Skittles of. And then if we hit a guess here for red Skittles, if I put 15, I hit guess, we get a message whether it's a bit high or a bit low. If we get it right, it will tell us we got it right. Still a bit low. I'm gonna get this. Ooh. Nice. It'll say, you won, nice work. It'll count my guesses. And if I hit reset, I'm actually taken back to my original screen here. And then I can play the game again. One of the other additions is that I can choose the number of random colors that I have. So we're going to go ahead and get going. Here, have people been able to access at least the source code in the Lecture 9 Skittles? Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and get started here. Fitz, do I need to zoom in here at all on my Vim? You think it's okay? Just a little bit here. Okay, awesome. So let's go ahead and get started here. We'll see how much of this we can get through. I've broken this out into a number of steps. Some of them are pretty easy, but some of them might take more time. So where we left off basically is if I hit start, I fill the jar with a random number of Skittles. And this is currently going over the page. So I think what I need to do here. Okay, no. So when we every time we hit start, we fill the jar, we empty it, and we keep going. So this is basically where we left off. We also had some functionality there to count the total number of Skittles and get random colors. And so we'll use this as we fill in the rest of our code. Currently we have our start button where we click start, we fill the jar, which this function we already implemented, which we know already. Down here in fill jar, we just created a bunch of Skittles and appended them into the jar container. The only thing that I have changed from last time is I have set a global constant at the top, max Skittles, to be 154. Seems relevant. And I've also updated the colors to choose from. So previously it was only 3 colors. I've added 3 more to make this 6. So the first thing we want to do here now, after filling the jar with Skittles, is we want to switch over to this new view. We want to switch over to the actual game view. Okay, and so how do we want to do that? Well, if we look in our HTML here, we have 2 views. We have the menu view, which is the starting view that we see. And then we have the game view with an ID of game view and a class of hidden. So after we fill the jar, we want to go ahead and add the class hidden to our menu view and remove it from our game view. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So I'll just access the menu view container. I'll add my class hidden. Okay, and then I'll do something very similar for game view, except I'll remove the class hidden. So now let's save that. Let's reload the page, see how that goes. Hit start here. Obviously, I have made the mistake here, which is a very common mistake. I've included the actual symbol for the ID, the selector. We don't need to do that because we're using get element by ID. So let's try this again. Okay, great. I have hidden the start menu, and I have now revealed the game view. Okay, great. So now let's go to part 2 here. And we're going to add a little bit more to fill jar. Instead of just filling the jar, we're also going to get a random color for us to guess the number of Skittles of. So back over here, if you remember, when I hit start, I fill the jar with a number of Skittles, but I also chose a color for us to guess. So I want to update our fill jar functionality to add in this ability. So going back over to our page here, I want to set the title string and class with a random color. So let's go over to our HTML. If you see here in the header, we have this H1 element. It says how many Skittles are in the jar, and then we have this span here that has the ID color. So we want to do two things. We want to insert a color name there, and we also want to set the class of that particular span to be the color that we want to guess. Now, in our fancy CSS for this page, if you look down at the bottom, we have these colors here that actually one color the Skittle, but we'll also change the color of our text in that span in the header element when we add a specific color name as a class. So let's go ahead and get our span element. So we can do that by using ID color, no hashtag needed. We can, so we'll set the text content equal to, and we don't have a random color yet, but we do have a random color function, so we can set a variable for that, get random color. Okay, set my text content equal to random color. And I can also add a class name to this span element by doing ID color class list.add rand color. Okay, so let's reload the page and see if this works. Okay, great. So I have how many gray Skittles are in the jar. Okay, well, obviously I have forgotten to add in a space here when I'm setting the text content of my span. So I want to go ahead and add that here with just a space. Let's go ahead and hit start again, and this looks a little bit better. So now we have one of the random colors from our colors array. And just as a reminder, we created this functionality last time, and you can see this here on lines 79 to 81. We'll be updating that as well. And so now we have our final fill jar function. So we have a question. It says, when we are guessing purple, the color of the text purple is actually gray. That may be something in the CSS. I'm not sure. Thanks for pointing that out. We'll definitely want to fix that. But I think the functionality, at least, is still intact despite our CSS typo. So moving on here to part 3. So right now, when we get a random color, we are actually using the entire, choosing colors from the entire array of colors. However, as we saw here in the final version, I can select the number of colors that I want to use for the Skittles in the jar. So if I hit 6 here, I hit start, I get 6 different colors, which is our default right now. But we may want to only have 2 colors. So we want to update our get random color to allow us to only have 2, 4, or 6 colors in this jar. Well, the first thing we need to do is select the currently selected number of colors. We need to find the value of the selected radio input here. And I know we haven't really gone over these elements. We will. They're not that complicated, but some of the selectors for getting the currently selected input are kind of tricky. We don't expect you to know them right now. Just know that they will be explained, and just sort of take them at face value for right now. But if I go over into my HTML, I can see here on lines 27, 28, and 29, I have my inputs with a type of radio, which is what makes them appear this way. That type attribute makes these inputs different from, a text input or a checkbox. So radio are these toggleable inputs here. And then I can set a value attribute on them, as I've done here with 2, 4, and 6. And I can access that attribute as a property on my HTML element. So just quickly here, if I just show you in the query selector, or in the console here, I can do document.querySelector, and I can do input, and I can actually specify the type. This is an attribute selector, so I can select inputs with the type radio, and I'm just going to select the first one here. And I have an input here. This is the very first one that appears, has a value 2. I can see these attributes. I'm going to assign this to a variable really quickly. And if I do input.value, you can see I actually get the value from that attribute in the HTML. So we have a question from Aaron, says, by default, is only one of the 3 allowed to be checked, or do we set that? So if you group these together using the name attribute, then, as in grouping them together as in they all have the same name attribute value, then only one of them can ever be selected at a time. And you can choose which one is selected on page load by setting the checked attribute on that particular radio element. And then, though, it can be changed obviously dynamically, but only one will ever appear. If you don't use the name attribute with the same value, then they won't be grouped together, and then all of them could be selected at the same time. And then Aman is asking, would the access value be of type string or an integer? So by default, this is going to be a string. However, there is a function here which was mentioned, I believe, by one of your fellow students last Wednesday for how to convert a string into a integer, and we can use parseInt to do that, for example. And I can just do the same thing here on my input value. So we now want to select the radio input that has been selected by the user. So we know how to get at least an input of type radio. So let's go ahead and do that. We can do query selector input type equals radio. And this will give us the very first radio button or toggle, but we actually want the one that is currently selected. So what we need to do is add in another pseudo selector. And we can do that by adding checked at the end here, :checked, and that will give us the currently checked value. See here, I changed it. Now using the checked pseudo selector, I get 6. If I were to change this over to 2 and do this again, you'll see I'll get now the one with value 2. So here in our code, we want to go ahead and add checked here. And then I want to get its value. And this is the maximum number of colors. So let's just call this num colors equals input.value. But that is going to be a string. Instead, we want an integer. So we're going to use parse int on our input value. And then here we want to update what we currently have written here that allows us to choose a color from the entire colors array. We want to update it so that we're only choosing colors up to a certain index in our colors array that has been specified by the user by selecting one of these radio inputs. So can somebody tell me what here on line 81 I need to change to make it so that I only choose colors up to a certain index using our num colors variable? Right. Okay, Aman said colors.length. So we want to replace colors.length with our num colors variable. Okay. So assuming all of this worked, I should now be able to come back up here and get a random color, add it to the text, to my header, and also add the class list. And this should all be dependent on the number of colors I have allowed via this input here. So let's try this out. Let's reload the page, see how this goes. So let's try 2 colors. I hit start. Okay, I only have 2 colors. That's great. Let's go ahead and reload. Let's try 4. Let's see 4 here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's make sure this works with 6. Okay, great. So it looks like we have 6 colors here with the purple thrown in. So the question Jeremy said, what is type inside input but not checked? You're referring to the selector on line 75? Okay, so the type here, this bracket notation allows us, this is what is called an attribute selector in CSS. So I can actually search for elements that have not only certain attributes, but also certain values of attributes. And the type attribute on inputs sets the behavior and the visual appearance of our input. So I can show you in our HTML that we do have multiple inputs. So here on 27, 28, and 29, we have radio inputs. It is an input element, but it has type radio, and so it appears as these buttons, these toggles here. But we also have the same exact input element down here for our number of guesses. That is, this box here is also an input element, but it looks vastly different. It's very different, has totally different behavior, and all of that is triggered by the value or the type attribute here. I could also make this text. There's a number of different options for inputs, and we will go into this. But on this particular page, we have the 2 types of radio and number. And then checked doesn't have to be inside here because this is a different type of selector. This is a pseudo selector. And the only thing here that goes in the brackets are attributes. Now, what you're thinking is, I'm sure, is that there is a checked attribute on this input, right? So what would happen if I selected for that query, for that attribute, or I queried just for the checked attribute? Well, that would also work. So I can update this And if I put in here, I want the input with the checked attribute, I would get back attribute 4, or excuse me, input 4, because it has the checked attribute. But I have set this in my HTML, and this is actually static. So if I change over here to the 2 and do this again, I'm still going to get back my input with the value 4 because it has the checked attribute on it. So the checked attribute tells you which one is going to appear clicked when my page loads, but this is not actually necessarily the currently selected input. We have to use the pseudo selector :checked to make sure that we get the one that the user has checked. Okay, so let's move on here to the next part. So now we actually want to make a guess here. So we finally added all of our colors. We have the number of Skittles, or the color of the Skittles that we want to guess the number of. So now when we hit enter, we want to make a guess, and we want to validate that guess when we click the guess button. So up here on line 10, we have already bound a click listener that calls make guess. So here we want to first get the value of the guess that the user has made. So we can do that by getting our guess input. And this happens to have a ID of guess here on 38. So I can just reference that by ID. And then I can get the value of that the same way I did from the radio input by just doing value. Okay, but once again, this is this going to be a number or a string? It's still going to be a string, so I need to go ahead and parse int on that. Okay, so now I have my actual guess number. And then what I want to do next is find the actual number of Skittles we're trying to guess. So the only place that I haven't saved that as a local variable on my page, or excuse me, as a global variable on my page. I probably could have done that so that I could just access that variable to get the color so that I know which Skittle to search for. But in this case, I haven't done that. So I need to go back and get the color that we're guessing off of the page. And I can do that by just finding by just querying back again our color text content. And the color element refers to this element here, the span, and its text content is the color that we're searching for. Again, a better way might have been to save this color as a global variable to access later, but in this case we didn't do that, so we're pulling it directly off the page again. So next we want to know how many Skittles of this color actually exist. So we need to do actual number, and we need, how would we, given the color of the Skittle, how would we query the Skittles of that particular color? What is the CSS selector for that, given that we have the color variable? What would I write to get those color Skittles? So we know we're going to start with query selector all. I was about to write query selector, but you guys saved me here. So query selector all dot Skittle, we know because all Skittles have that class. And then we want to go ahead and add the period because our next class, what we're adding, is also another class. And as we know, we don't put spaces when we have multiple class names on the same element. And then correct, we're going to add here color. Okay, so now we have here um, a node list of all of the Skittles of that color. And let's go ahead and just console log that. And again, this is just going to be the Skittles of that particular color. So let's go back here, hit start, and let's do a guess here. And so blue Skittles, and you can see here, I am actually getting the number of blue Skittles. So it looks like that worked out. But then how would we make this instead of a node list? How do we get its length? What is the property for that? Right, just length. Okay. So now I have the actual user guess as well as the true number of Skittles in my jar. And just one more time, for my sanity's sake here, make sure that we actually print out the number of Skittles here, 33. Great. So now what we need to do is compare our guess with the actual answer. So we're going to do a bunch of if statements here. So if guess is equal to the actual number, we'll do something else. If the guess is lower than our actual, then we'll do something. And then else if guess is greater than our actual number, we'll do something else. And so in each of these circumstances, we want to do the same thing. We want to display a message, and we want to update the guess counter. We'll do something a little bit different if they get it right. But for each of these three cases, we're still going to display a message and update the guess counter. And so if we go over to our HTML, we do have a little element here, results for displaying message. So that's where we'll put our message is in this particular container. And then we also have our guest count in this span here with an ID of guest count. So let's go back here and just starting off with when we get it right, let's get our results container, and we'll set the text content equal to nice, you got it right. And then we'll also update the guess count. And here it's already set to 0. And so we need to get the text content, we need to set it actually equal to itself plus 1. And because our text content is text, we need to do a parse int on this. So we once again need to get guess count dot text content, and then add 1 to it. And then we're going to be doing something similar to all of these here. So I'm just going to copy paste this. And at the end here, if it was too low, let's say too low. And if it was greater than, let's say too high. And let's go ahead and reload this and see if we can at least get this part working before time runs out. Let's do 5. And it says too low. The actual number is 65. Let's try 70. Oops. I can't find the 7 key. That says too high, guesses so far. So that is working. We're over time here. If we wanted to, if you want to stay, I'm going to show one more quick thing. But again, we are over time, so please feel free to go. The video will be online. But one more thing I wanted to show here is with this guess count. So although this isn't although text content isn't an integer, I can actually change all of this to just be plus plus at the end here. And sorry, I've got my caps lock on, which is causing mayhem. So this will actually work the exact same way, because once again, the browser is really nice to us. It says, oh, I see this increment operator, but I have text. So I'm going to cast this, I'm going to convert this into an integer and then do this operation and then assign it to the text content. So if I reload the page, I will get the same behavior as I had before. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Sorry, I didn't finish the example, ran out of time there, but let me go back through these questions here. Brandon, who may or may not be in the room right now, is that bad Boolean Zen, since if it's not equal and it's not less than, then it must be a greater than? I actually wrote that because I was intending on covering the case where you input a negative number, but in this particular case, you would actually fall out of this loop if you had, or your if statements, if you had a negative number, and so none of these cases would catch. So it would be better for us to account for that case specifically, and we would probably just do that with an else statement, not an else if. Why can't you just increase the guess count once after the loop? You could, and I think I think that that's fine, but I believe the issue is somebody mentioned that the actual game functionality resets the guesses on a correct guess. So I'm not sure if that's true or not, but you may need to do something different when you have the right answer. So you may not be repeating the same thing, so you may not need to update it, or you can't update it after the loop. But if it did get, if everything was the same for each case you incremented, then you could do it after the loop. That would be fine. Why can't you just, can you do, where am I? Can you do text content plus a number, or does it only work for text content plus plus? The problem occurs if my text content is not a number. So the browser is going to try to parse it, and it's not going to work. And in that case, I'm actually going to cast to an integer. So if my text content were 2, let me just show you really quickly. If I had 2 plus any number, I'm going to get back a string. So this works a little bit differently. So instead of casting my number to a string, I'm actually casting my string into a number, then incrementing it, and then casting it back. You don't need to know this trick. It's just something to be aware of. It might be better to do it explicitly, just so you don't have to worry about this sort of magic that's going on. Personally, I think explicitly is better. So the way we had it before, I think speaks more clearly to what's really going on. But it is just kind of a neat oddity that you can do the plus plus operator, the increment operator. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to get back over to the text, the chat. Could you repeat what you said about some anonymous functions expected something as a first parameter? I got lost. Hold that thought, Jeremy.